So hello and welcome back to Palestine Deep Dive. My name is Ahmed Alnaouq, and today I also have another special guest. My guest is Tayab Ali. Tayab Ali is the head of the international law at London law firm Bindmans, and he's also the director of the International Center for Justice for Palestinians. Thank you very much for joining us, Tayab.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really great to be with you, Ahmed.
Of course, thank you. So today, there is a headline in The Guardian that says, UK reportedly suspends arm export license application for Israel pending review. Can you please start by telling us what does that even mean? And if that's true, is it enough?
I mean, what does it mean? That is literally $1 million question. I have no idea what it actually means. And this is one of these very strange news stories that have come about because of without any formal confirmation from the Foreign Office or from the government. And it appeared to be either one of two things, either a leak that governments sometimes do to sort of test the water and see what people's reaction is going to be to it, or as in one of the articles, people who tried to apply for a license or tried to obtain a license were told that the process was suspended. But in reality, what does it mean? Well, what part of your question is this good enough? Well, no, it's not good enough because we don't understand what it actually means. The best case scenario here is that what the British government's done is that it's suspended arms export licenses pending its own internal review. So it doesn't want to get itself into a position where it finds that it's actually complicit in a war crime by sending some weapons or authorizing some new licenses. And while it works out whether it should or should not do that, the best case scenario is that. And of course, the end result of that should be that it decides that it would be unlawful for it to continue to arm and weaponize a state which is suspected of committing the most heinous war crimes we've seen across the globe in decades. And so that's what it could mean. But in reality, I'd stay away from these types of headlines, and we really need the government to be really specific about its own position and what they intend to do, and whether or not they've actually halted supplying weapons and military support to Israel, or whether it's just some noise in the wind. And until it does that, I think it really amounts to a meaningless headline and a meaningless article and a meaningless position by the British government at this stage.
Well, you know, in October last year, Israel dropped a bomb in my home, killing my family members, 21 members of my family, including 14 kids who are all under the age of 14. And then 1 or 2 months later, I hosted Andrew Feinstein, who's an expert in army trades. And I wanted to see that bomb or that vehicle that carried the bomb that destroyed my family and destroyed my home. And he told me something interesting. He told me that parts of these vehicles that carried the weapon were manufactured in the UK. So literally, the UK participated in the murder of my family, and they participated in the murder of more than 40,000 Palestinian civilians and non-civilians. More than 40,000 Palestinians were killed because of these weapons that manufactured in the UK. So I know for sure that the F-35 and F-16 that might bomb my family were manufactured in the UK. Do you know what other weapons that the UK still sends to Israel?
Well, Ahmed, I just want to say, and you probably already know this, my deepest condolences to you for your personal loss. And, the International Center of Justice for Palestinians, its very essence is to try to support and prevent the types of things that have happened to you. I feel ashamed that we don't have the strength or the political will to intervene in these situations before people lose their lives. So I just want to say that, and I recognize the limitations that we have as a NGO, as an organization, but I still feel that we need to do everything that we can as strongly as possible, particularly because of the situation that you find yourself in. And again, from myself and my organization and my staff, our deepest condolences to you.
Thank you.
I know these are only words, but it's all I really have at the moment. I'm sorry. And coming to your question, I think it's difficult for us to know precisely at this stage the weaponry that the United Kingdom is sending to Israel. But what I can tell you is that since 2015, the UK licensed around 474 million pounds worth of military equipment to Israel. And this includes really serious tech, including combat aircrafts, missiles, tanks, technology, small arms, including ammunition. And since 2008, it's licensed arms worth 576 million to Israel. Now, on the grand scheme of things, that is a small proportion of the armaments that Israel uses, but it's significant because £1 of British taxpayers' money or money spent in this trade can result in the loss of life, as Ahmed, you only know too well. But what I can say to you about the F-35 stealth bomber, which is really an important aspect of the Israeli occupation forces infrastructure, is that 15% of the components are sourced from the United Kingdom. And that's a significant proportion. And that 15% isn't just going into an airplane, it's going into assisting the Israeli occupation forces in killing thousands, I mean, literally thousands of innocent civilians and children. And the United Kingdom also is responsible for the durability testing of the F-35 that takes place in the United Kingdom. The government's admitted, and this is something else which is really important. During Operation Cast Lead, following that, I was involved in the legal team that obtained an arrest warrant for Zippy Livni, and I've spoken about that a lot over the last 11 months. But the government admitted that the United Kingdom supplied components that were used in the 2008-2009 Operation Cast Lead, which resulted in a British court issuing an arrest warrant for a person that was involved in those war crimes or alleged to have been involved in those war crimes. But you know what, Ahmed? It's not really literally the pound for pound items that the United Kingdom sends. It's also the fact that this makes the United Kingdom complicit in the alleged war crimes perpetrated by Israel. And that's what's really significant here. If a country is supplying another country with not only physical armaments, but also military support, it's effectively saying, look, what you're doing is okay. We're happy to send you our weaponry. We're happy for you to carry on using our weaponry in that way. And I think that's why this issue is so important in this current 11 months and going back to 2009 and going forward to whatever we see might happen in the next coming weeks and months.
Well, it's really interesting that the UK issued arrest warrants against Zippy Livni during after Cast-led operation. So the UK knew that the Israeli officials were using these weapons illegally and they're committing war crimes. So why didn't the UK stop these army trades to Israel?
Well, I think this is
that they're really killing the innocent people in Gaza.
I think this is part of the problem, Ahmed. And it's part of I describe it as a mistake lawyers like myself, man. I repeatedly say that. And that's being self-critical about the way we've deployed strategies in the past. In the past, we've only issued complaints or applied for arrest warrants for actors in the theater of war. So IDF soldiers on the ground, for example, Israeli ministers, Israeli generals. And we've kind of left those people that are complicit or the political support for that out of the framework. We've not really looked at that. We've known about it, we've not really attacked it. This time is different. Now we can see very clearly that where a British court, for example, in 2009, issued an arrest warrant, it's very clear they made a decision that there was a prima facie case against an Israeli for war crimes. And what the political class did in the United Kingdom was not only continue to supply weapons in that context, they changed the law, Ahmed. They changed the law to give protection to Israeli war criminals and probably other war criminals too. And that's something that is disgusting. It's something that we can't allow. And it's clearly complicity in those war crimes. If you're protecting a war criminal, you are becoming effectively a war criminal. And that's something new for us. In this last 11 months, we've now been looking and examining and in fact issued complaints about British ministers that are complicit in these types of war crimes.
Tayeb, let me ask you, why is Israel above the law, above the international law, and also above the British law?
It's a good question. I mean, I suppose it's
What is so
the
special about Israel?
Well, I mean, there's nothing special about Israel. Do you know, I think I've described this previously. I mean, before the October the 7th, the impunity and immunity that Israel enjoys, and I say enjoys because it feels in the moment as though it's something that benefits Israel. I've described it as a curse because what you end up having when you give an actor impunity and immunity from the rule of law, effectively from understanding what the law requires of them, is you allow them to deteriorate into lawlessness. You allow them to deteriorate into a situation that we see in Israel. Israel is not a happy place. Israel is not a comfortable country. It is on the brink of a regional war against multiple foreign states because of its actions, because of its impunity, because of its lack of restraint, and because of the support that foreign states give it. This ultimately transpires in not one or two deaths, but thousands of deaths for Palestinians and potentially thousands of deaths of, oh, we've already seen 1,200 people, Israelis die. So if this escalates and carries on, it's going to get worse for Israelis and Palestinians. That's why this is a curse. When you apply international law, when you apply the rule of law to a situation, when you pull back people from breaching international law, it shows restraint. It shows a willingness to live in cooperation with your neighbors. That's not where we are at the moment. So this impunity that Israel temporarily enjoys is as a curse, Ahmed. It's not a benefit to them.
Well, I think it is. And this war is dragging on. It's been 9 months now. And this morning even, Hezbollah, there was a speech for Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah. And he's threatening Israel, and he keeps firing missiles at Israel. And Israel could stop all of this by ending the war, ending the genocide in Gaza. But Israel is so arrogant that they are willing to receive lots of missiles, threats, regional war, then stop the genocide in Gaza. It's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense for me. But anyway, let's go back to the armed trade with the UK. So we have seen government ministers like David Lammy draw distinction between offensive and defensive weapons being sold to Israel. My question to you is that a fair distinction? And what does it mean, offensive
Well,
and defensive, when it comes to genocide?
I mean, it's a fiction. It's an attempt at what we call a legal fiction, which is where you create something which you know not to be true, but for to achieve a viable objective and a viable end. There is no distinction between offensive and defensive weapons, number one. And secondly, and more importantly, actually, even if you were to draw some sort of fictitious distinction between what we call offensive and defensive weapons, like a riot shield to protect yourself,
Mm.
as opposed to a gun that you fire, Israel considers its action in killing over 40,000 civilians in Gaza
Self-defense.
self-defense. So even if you provided weapons which were technically or said to be defensive, they would use them in that execution of that military action in Gaza and probably in the West Bank and probably in East Jerusalem and probably further afield because they consider everything that they do to be an act of self-defense. And you've heard our own Prime Minister now, when he was in opposition, Keir Starmer, and David Lammy repeatedly say that Israel is entitled to the right to self-defense. But we've seen now in clear detail what Israel considers self-defense looks like in other people's eyes, in the ICC prosecutor's eyes. That self-defense looks like a war crime. In my eyes, with my investigation, that looks like a war crime. So I don't buy this distinction between offensive and defensive weapons. And in any event, even if you did give defensive weapons, what does that really tell you? It tells you that you promote and strengthen the impunity and immunity of the aggressive state. Because what it does is it says, well, hang on a minute, I can go and slap the person down the road as much as I want. They can't touch me because I've got loads of defensive weapons. So
Yeah,
it does
exactly.
prevent the offensive nature of the state. And so therefore, the only real answer is to draw Israel back and to restrain it and to hold it accountable for the criminal acts it's allegedly already done.
And Israel calls its army Israeli Defense Army. So everything Israel does, they say it's in self-defense. So how can you draw a distinction? But we also heard that David Lammy and Keir Starmer were not happy that your organization, the International Center for Justice for Palestinians, put them on notice for potential prosecution while in opposition for their complicity in Israel's crime against the Palestinians. But now they are in government. So how have the responsibilities changed, and should they even be more worried now?
Well, you're right in saying that we also heard these noises, let's say, from the opposition and also from government at the time, which was a conservative government, that they weren't happy with our organization and putting them on notice that if they became complicit in war crimes, that we would prosecute them or seek to prosecute them. Now, how that's changed is that it's important to explain the difference in what happened. So we did issue notices, not that these politicians were complicit. The notices were that if they continued in certain rhetoric and certain action, they would become complicit, and that's really important. And then we followed through, and it wasn't an empty notice or an empty threat or an empty gesture. It was actually something that we followed through on. And so what I mean by that is that we actually have issued a complaint with regards to 5 former government ministers from the Conservative government that we say went over the line of just rhetoric and actually were, we say, are complicit in war crimes. That complaint is being looked at by Scotland Yard. That complaint, we continue to liaise with Scotland Yard with regards to that. We didn't make a complaint about anybody in the Labour Party because they were in opposition. We didn't consider them to be in a position of control, and we considered the rhetoric that they were using in the beginning after they received our notices and warnings from many other organizations and people. They did modify their language, although of course it wasn't how we wanted it to be, but it was sufficient, I think, to prevent any kind of criminal liability at that moment in time. But now they're in government, Ahmed. Now they're in government. They're in a different position. And I'm watching, we at the ICJP are watching them. Our investigation team is watching them very closely. If they continue to do acts that at the hand, as the captains and the stewards of the British government, that we say support war crimes abroad and make them complicit in war crimes, then we will do the same thing that we did with the previous government and issue actual complaints to Scotland Yard with regards to them. But I have to say, to their credit to date, they have refunded UNRWA. They have taken steps in removing the jurisdictional arguments of the ICC. It does look like the trajectory is going in the right way. Now, we just hope that that's real, and we hope that that doesn't stall. We hope that doesn't stop. I really want to support the government to do the right thing. And I think my organization is trying our best to engage with government, to engage with ministers, to engage with members of parliament, to make sure that they understand their responsibilities. And there are some really strong signals coming from government that they're going in the right direction. We want to make sure that they do go in the right direction. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. There's a lot of work for them to do, Ahmed. There's a lot of work for them to do. And one of the important ones is how you started with your questions in this interview, which is weapon supply. If the British government supplies weapons to Israel, which Israel is likely to use to execute military acts which are in violation of international law, and even give military support, then I'm afraid that we'll be probably drafting complaints against the Labour government, which I really hope we don't have to do.
And with respect to the recent ICJ ruling that said that the Israeli occupation in the Palestinian occupied territories is illegal, so what should the government in the UK be doing right now?
Well, I mean, let's just take this one step back. Before the ICJ, there's our international regular treaty obligations, as well as our own policy. So we've got the International Arms Trade Treaty, and we've got the UK Strategic Export Licensing Criteria. Now, my law firm, Bindmans, is engaged with GLAN, Global Legal Action Network, and halt, which is, a Palestinian rights organization based in Palestine. And we have challenged the United Kingdom government's issuing of export licenses in the in respect of weapons for Israel. Now, the reason we've done that is we consider that the British government has failed to apply its own criteria when making an assessment in one, whether or not to issue a license in the first place, and secondly, whether or not to transfer weapons. Now, it would be unlawful if the UK government transferred military equipment and technology where there was a risk that that equipment might be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international law. If what we've seen in Gaza over the 11 months isn't serious violations of international law, then there may as well not be international law, because I can't think of a better example of violations of international law. And then there's also a license shouldn't be issued in circumstances where there's a clear risk that the items provided would undermine peace and security. And I think what the Israel's activity ticks both those boxes. I just want to just headline this bit. I think that the British government civil service lawyers that have given legal advice to the British government or the previous British government are probably worried about that legal advice. It's probably the main reason why that legal advice hasn't been published. It probably is, on the face of it, inappropriate legal advice, at the very worst, negligent and potentially criminal legal advice. And if that's the case, then we would want to see that advice. We want to see the lawyers that are behind that advice, and we want to see whether that issuance of that advice makes those lawyers actually criminally liable. I mean, as a lawyer, you can't just write a document because you're a lawyer and say, I justify this kind of action, and therefore you can go off and do it. You can't justify engaging in war crimes. You can't justify engaging in terrorism, for example, even if it's a lawyer that's saying that you could do that. That's not appropriate. And so that's something that we need to look at very carefully. So that's the primary thing that the British government should be looking at. Then now coming to the ICJ advisory opinion, which was monumental, historic, and really important. And what it did is it outlined and defined the status of the occupied Palestinian territories, most importantly, as a single territorial unit. And it considered West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem to be that single territorial unit. And that gives it sovereignty, and that gives it some form of recognition. And the first thing that I'd say about the United Kingdom is that as a result of the ICJ, it can't any longer wait to determine and make a decision about recognition of Palestine, because Palestine exists. The ICJ says it's a single territorial unit. You don't need to wait until you enter into some sort of negotiation with Israel, the person that's being ruled to being in unlawful occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories, to decide that when they're ready to allow you to recognize, you recognize it. And actually, the United Kingdom is on the wrong side of history already, because the majority of the world recognizes Palestine as a state. And if it wasn't for the power of veto at the Security Council, it would be a full member of the United Nations. Palestine would be a full member of the United Nations right now. But anyway, the outcome of the ICJ advisory opinion is, I'm just going to list a few very important aspects of it. Member states are now under an obligation not to recognize any changes in the physical character or demographic composition, institutional structure, or status of the territory occupied by Israel since the 5th of June, 1967. They're obliged to abstain from entering into economic or trade dealings with Israel concerning the occupied Palestinian territories or parts which may entrench its unlawful presence in the territory, which brings us back to weapons, doesn't it? You know, this is a trade agreement. To abstain in the establishment and maintenance of diplomatic missions in Israel, from recognition of its legal presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, and to take steps to prevent trade or investment relations that assist in the maintenance of the illegal situation created by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. I mean, it goes on, the obligations go on. Essentially, what the obligations require the United Kingdom to do is to assist the international community together through the United Nations to dismantle the occupation of the Palestinian territories and to recognize Palestinian as an independent sovereign state. That's what the totality of the ICJ ruling, really important ruling, meant. And I want to also say this before I come to how the ICJ's advisory opinion impacts on weapons, right? The ICJ, people refer to the ICJ. In fact, I was with a very senior former ministerial lawyer recently. I was having dinner with him. We were discussing this, and we were discussing whether the ICJ's opinion is binding, and whether what this issue was with it being called an advisory opinion. It's a red herring, okay? The ICJ, what it's done in its advisory opinion is settled international law in relation to Israel and its relationship to the occupied Palestinian territory. There is no longer any scope for debate or interpretation on it. The advisory opinion is advising the world on the state of the law in relation to that situation, is binding in that respect. So if you disagree with it and do something opposite, you are acting unlawfully. And if a state was to bring a complaint about you acting in a different way, so let's say, for example, continuing to supply weapons, continuing to support the occupation, and let's say, for example, in South Africa or any other state, brought a complaint to the ICJ in it, it would use its advisory opinion to explain what the settled law was, to find that that state had violated international law. So it's an advisory opinion in that it's not an opinion that's binding on another state because there's two parties in a dispute. And if there's no parties in the dispute and a party asks for an explanation about the law, so you call it an advisory opinion. It's binding and it's important and it has legal teeth and it has effect. So let me come to I know I've given you a very long answer, Ahmed, about this, but let me just come to the ICJ's position and what that means in respect to Israel and weapons. Well, the United Kingdom, by continuing to grant export licenses for arms to be transferred to Israel, where the Israeli military is using them in Gaza to commit serious international crimes, the UK would be violating the direct obligations imposed on states by the ICJ. That's number one. Number two, by continuing to grant export licenses that are used in the manner that I'd earlier described, the UK is contributing to changes in the physical character and demographic composition because Israel is engaged in occupation and settlement of that land. Export licenses are also continued examples and demonstration of trade dealings, which are now forbidden with Israel because it directly entrenches Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied territory. And so another aspect of this, by the United Kingdom government continuing to grant export licenses, the UK government is rendering aid or assistance in maintaining the illegal situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. It's very clear to me, it will be very clear to the British government lawyers, it will be very clear to the Attorney General that the ICJ has dramatically and directly altered the legal relationship and the legal obligations placed in the United Kingdom when it comes to Israel. It just now has to put those obligations into action.
And do you think that the UK government will put these obligations into action? Will they abide by their obligations, the responsibilities?
Well, you know, Ahmed, people, I took a lot of flack when I came out and championed the International Criminal Court, you know, after October the 7th. Lots of people across the globe lost faith in it, and I didn't want to. I mean, I had my doubts, and I
lost my hope in it, actually.
Yeah, but I didn't. Right? And I was certain that the evidence would speak for itself. The velocity of the criminal acts on the ground in Gaza rendered the ICC in two positions. One, it would become irrelevant forever, or it would have to act. And the ICC prosecutor, to his credit, lived up to his mandate and he applied for arrest warrants. And we now know the immense pressure from Mossad and international actors that these individuals faced personally. We now know that, right? So we can understand a little bit. And to their credit, they didn't keep that pressure to themselves. They attacked the people that were perpetrating that pressure, and they explained to them that they would also find themselves subject to the ICC. So I still have faith in the ICC. I will tell you now, if I was to bet my house on it, I would say that arrest warrants will eventually be issued. They will eventually be issued. They'll be issued for Israeli war criminals, suspected war criminals, and then Israel will have a different problem on its hands, right? And so will the United States, and so will the United Kingdom. So I think that will happen. And the reason why I start to answer your question in this way is is because if the British government does not abide by the ICJ advisory opinion and the settled state of law as it currently stands, and continues to act with complicity to these alleged war crimes, those individual actors in the British government will render themselves liable under Article 25 of the Rome Statute to being complicit to war crimes. And organizations like mine, not just mine, but like mine, will make sure that we pursue those individuals and for as long as it takes to ensure that they are also prosecuted for war crimes. There are 5 people in the Conservative government that are no longer in government positions, have not been let off the hook. We are continuing to pursue arrest warrant applications and criminal complaints against those individuals, both in this country, at the ICC, and abroad.
Oh, thank you very much. And I think the least that should happen is arrest warrants. Arrest warrants should be issued against Netanyahu and the war criminals, but I don't think that is even enough, because it's not only Netanyahu and Gallant who perpetrated these war crimes, it's a whole of an army in Israel, and all of these people should find prosecution, to be honest. One last thing I would like to hear your take on, which is the riots that happen in the UK right now, in the streets of the UK. And we know, as you know, that these riots and these movements were inspired by some figures like Tommy Robinson, who has referenced the UK Gaza protests as reasons to be angry. And he demanded his followers to take back our streets. Now, you know that Tommy Robinson is someone who has, I don't know if you know that or not, but it's become clear that Tommy Robinson has some links, and he was reportedly funded by pro-Israeli groups in the past. In your opinion, is there any relationship between what we see in Gaza right now and what we see happening in the streets in the UK?
Well, I mean, look, what we're seeing happen with the far right, let's just call them riots for the moment, across the United Kingdom, is my view is that they're organized, they're coordinated. This is the tip of the iceberg. From criminal cases I've seen in the past, the far right has a significant capability and is significantly well resourced. And I have no doubt that they are being influenced and supported by actors abroad, whether that's the United States, Israel, or Russia. I have no evidence to explain or give an opinion about that. But you often find that these Tommy Robinson type of sort of cartoon figures, if you like, dangerous cartoon figures, right, are often manipulated and used because they have a following, they have a voice for somebody else's agenda. You know, you have the Andrew Tates, you have these kinds of individuals. But this goes beyond these kinds of individuals. I mean, first of all, I hope that the book is thrown at these individuals, and people that are saying things that are inciting violence on the internet and other places are held accountable for that really quickly and really ferociously. But look, it's beyond just the last few days and weeks. For a decade, right, the British government has entered into a program of austerity, of popularist ideology. They've tried to beat the far right by becoming the far right or impacting the far right policies. They've instead of living up to their responsibility of messing up Brexit, in messing up with austerity and taking money away from the poorest and the most needy people in our own country, and filling the boots of people. I mean, we've got more millionaires in the United Kingdom than we've ever had before, but we've also got a bigger divide between the poor and rich. But instead of dealing with that, instead of dealing with the fact that we have long waiting queues at the NHS, instead of dealing with the fact that our schools are falling apart, are literally falling apart, as well as having a lack of teachers, the police forces, instead of dealing with all this, instead of dealing with it properly and honestly and trying to find solutions for it, what the government did is it found an enemy, and it used the migrant issue to blame. I mean, the migrant issue is a tiny proportion of people that come to the United Kingdom. It can easily be dealt with within the grand scheme of the British fiscal environment. It doesn't need stopping migrants coming to the UK will not solve the problem that people are feeling in our inner cities. It just won't. And this sort of targeting of these minority groups is disgraceful, it's disgusting, and people are being radicalized by it. These writers on the street are being radicalized by it. And I draw a parallel to our to terrorist problems in the same way as a terrorist is radicalized. Somebody at the far right uses the same methodology to radicalize people, and they take them to go on the street. These people are now facing lengthy prison sentences. Some of the actions that I've taken, in my view, fall into the category of actual terrorist acts. I mean, it's a use or threat of violence in order to persuade a government of a policy based on to further an ideological or racial or advance a racial objective. And that's what's happening. That's the clear definition of terrorism. But, you know, it goes beyond the sort of weird kind of Tommy Robinson, Lawrence Fox, Andrew Tate, even Elon Musk type actors, and goes to real mainstream politicians like Lord Shawcross, who wrote the extremism report, Michael Gove, who's targeted, in my view, Muslims in this country and tried to redirect policing and policy away from the far right to Muslims. People like Swallow Braverman, people like Priti Patel, people like the Pied Piper Farage. You know, these people are responsible for what we're seeing happening in the United Kingdom. And let's not forget that, because this is these are effectively now our mainstream politicians, and they need to be held accountable for what they have done. And, you know, when Shawcross wrote his review, the objective behind that was to realign policing resources away from the far right and to Islamist political violence. Well, we've seen the truth of it now, haven't we? We've seen that the far right is well organized and able to cause mayhem across the country, put people's lives at risk by burning or trying to burn down hotels with human beings in them, right? With the call to kill people on the street by singling out minority groups, within Muslims or otherwise. And do you know what? This is not just it is a Muslim problem right now. It's an Islamophobic problem right now. But don't think it will stop there. It will carry on to white Europeans. It will carry on to white Jewish people, because the far right does not care for these individuals. You know, it does not care for them. And the mistake that people are making right now is to think that it's targeted just with Muslims. It's not. The way you deal with this right now is we unify and we push it away. And the far right doesn't have a mandate, Ahmed. We've just had a general election. Where were they?
Yeah.
Much the same as in France, where the electorate, the majority rejected them. The same happened in the United Kingdom. Reform doesn't have a massive footprint. This is why they need to riot, because they want to make it look like they have a footprint. There are far more of us reasonable people, be as Muslims, be as Jewish, be as from whatever ethnicity, religion, whatever we are, there are far more of us that believe in unity, that believe in cohesion, that believe in cooperation. And we will not allow the far right to dictate the narrative. And what we'll find over the next 5 to 10 years is that a significant amount of those people, those unfortunate people that have been misled by these actors that I've talked about, are going to end up in prison anyway. It's a really sad state of affairs. But I don't think right now is a time for me to give you sort of theories about who the actors behind it are. And actually, that's the job of MI5 and MI6. If there is a national security threat to the United Kingdom, which comes from domestic, militant and or far-right organizers, or foreign organizers, that's their job. And the fact that they've allowed this to happen, and I use those words, allowed this to happen, is a failure on their part. They should be ashamed of themselves, and they should rapidly correct the national security vacuum and problem that we have in the UK. The only way you can deal with that is by analyzing what's happening in our country truthfully and honestly, and preventing people from their popularist fake news and misleading and radicalization agendas.
Tayab Ali, thank you very, very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.